There's Roger, you see. People think Roger is an average, better than average director, but a brilliant producer. You know, he can make films. But he's not really a producer. He is, of course, a brilliant producer. He is a director. What he is, he's an investor. He invests, it's not the money, although that too sometimes. It's the people. Any spark of talent, you know, that could become genius along the line. He looked for that. Paid them nothing, got them in. And in that sense, he was an investor. It's very like the way IT works now. You look for people in IT, you look for people who are brilliant game players, you know, video games and so forth. What Roger looked for were people who knew a lot about cinema. And that was how I got involved, really. I was one of those people. Not so successful, clearly, as Francis Coppola or Martin Scorsese or Jonathan Demme, but nonetheless, it was a brilliant opening for me. He wanted to do them cheaper than they could be done now, even in studios in Hollywood. So he found England. And he made a deal with Nat Cohen, who was the head of Anglo Amalgamated. EMI, I suppose is what it became. I can't remember what it was called. Anyway, Nat Cohen was the boss. So he made a deal to co-produce his next Poe movie in England with Nat Cohen and that company. David Deutsch, I think, was the producer. And that film was called Mask of the Red Death. And he was happy with that. So he came back to do another one, which was the Tomb of Ligeia. And that was it, really, for England. He had made several films in Ireland. Roger is an inveterate traveller. Everywhere he goes for a film deal. I mean, he never goes anywhere for itself, always because there's a deal there. Whether it's Ireland or Turkey or Romania. I mean, years before people went to these places to make films, he would be there. I got a job with Joe Losey, who I had done a lot of work with promoting his films, you know, writing about them. And he offered me, these are not really jobs. It's standing around learning and doing odd things that you're allowed to do. And that was on The Servant. Later, I did an interview with Roger Corman, among the many I did. And I'd seen a lot of his films, which surprised him because most of them are very, you know. So he said, look, I'm here to make a film from a Poe story called The Tomb of Ligeia. I'd like to ask you a favour. Would you look at my film script, the script I have, written by Robert Towne, who was then not the famous Robert Towne that he became, but a young, you know, would-be screenwriter. He said, would you look at it and see if there are any infelicities in it? So we're Americans, you're English, you can correct the expressions and so forth and make sure it has a period atmosphere and so on. So we met, I read the script, made a few comments. If you want to either point to its success or its blame, then probably Bob Towne is the man to look at, because he had a great deal more respect, shall I put it that way, for the material than perhaps Richard Matheson. Although Matheson's script's very good, but they are, apart from The Fall of the House of Usher, which is quite close, the others go off in all directions. And I think Bob tried to stay close to the spirit as he saw it. And I think Roger didn't quite spot that, if you want what the truth. I think he didn't realize when they were making it or when they started to shoot how different it was quite, and that the horror wasn't really horror. Yes, it had a dream sequence and it had all the things, but it wasn't quite as shocking as some of the others. And of course it ended up, however, with the burning building, which is what they used in Fall of the House of Usher, and I think in others, the Haunted Palace, I can't remember which ones now. He always had the same ending, you see, the building burns down. That's probably a Jungian thing, you burn the house down. The house being the body and, you know, all of that. And I was there with Roger, and Roger said, look, would you like to work on the film? I can always use them. So I said, that's fantastic. This is my first job on the film, as it were, doing something. So he said, look, I don't really know where to shoot this. I must find some abbey or castle or somewhere, because we have outside shots. So I started to look, and we came up with Castle Acre Priory, which is where it was shot, in Norfolk, near Swaffham. So he said, that's great. It then turned out that he was thinking about casting. He didn't want to spend money on a casting director, so he said to me, because he never wanted to spend money on anything if he didn't have to, so he said to me, well, do you got any ideas for the cast? Well, obviously, Vincent Price was playing the lead. A school friend of mine had a girlfriend called Elizabeth Shepherd, who was an actress. And I mean, had been on the stage at the West End and so. And I thought she'd be rather good, so I sent her along to Roger. He must have seen other people too. But anyway, Beth Shepherd got the job. And then I recommended a couple of other people, people I'd known or heard of and so on. So they were taken on board too. Some of my suggestions weren't. So I was not casting director, but I was involved in the production. I don't remember him asking me, Roger, about who the cameraman was to be. Obviously, on Mask of the Red Death, he had Nicholas Roeg. That was a special case in a way. I don't know how he came to hire Arthur Grant, who was thought of as a very workmanlike cameraman, a long history in English films. But I was very impressed with him. I was very impressed with his work. And I don't just mean the way it looked in the end, how he worked for Roger. He was very fast, and he was not in the least, fazed by the wide screen. There were a lot of films in England weren't made in widescreen. I mean, anamorphic then, and 1965. And he was really adept at the framing, And I'm sure Roger had much to do with that, but nonetheless, that is the work of the cameraman and the operator, especially with Roger, who's moving so fast and doesn't really storyboard. Maybe a couple of shots are storyboarded, but really not. So he depends on his cameraman for getting what he would want. And I thought the cameraman, Arthur Grant, did a terrific job. And I never thought about him, except that I remember him, first film. When I first got to know Joseph Losey, I visited the set. He took me on the set of The Damned, which Arthur Grant shot. And I thought, obviously I couldn't tell on the set, but when I saw the film, I thought he did a really good job. That was black and white cinemascope, widescreen. A really good job. I think he's an underrated cameraman. He's extremely reliable. He may not be inspirational, but he was terrifically helpful to Roger, I thought. Maybe not as exotic as Nick Roeg, but anyway, they didn't call for that, actually. But he was just as happy indoors, in interiors and outside. In fact, in a way, I think he was almost better outside. Perhaps that's being English, because English cameramen are all trained, like documentary training, really. Roger is very fast. He wants to be fast. And sometimes he's thinking about the next setup if it's some distance away when we're outside. He said, look, why don't you set this scene up? I mean, I've got something to do now. It'll only take you 20 minutes. So I set up a couple of scenes in the film. One was a tracking shot through a sort of archway, and there were a couple of other shots, more atmospheric shots rather than directing actors, and I didn't do that. So that was very exciting. Then he said, look, I think we need another scene in this film. I think we need, after Vincent Price and Elizabeth Shepherd get married, I need a honeymoon scene. I need something that, you know, shows them together, so we don't cut back into the oppressive atmosphere of the castle, palace. So I said, well, honeymoon? He said, fine, do me a honeymoon. So I wrote a sort of little voiceover, because the actors would never go anywhere, because he would never pay for that. So I had to think of probably using doubles or images for the honeymoon. Right? So I came up with a few lines of voiceover for where they were. I think a phrase I had was the wild country. I thought, well, that'll give some atmosphere. Then he said, that seems rather nice. Well, look, I'm going back to the States for the weekend. Why don't you shoot the thing? I said, well, how? He said, well, I'll give you a camera. He had his own Arriflex. He had some Panavision lenses. We were shooting in Panavision, although it really wasn't Panavision. It was some fake Panavision, but anamorphic lens, you know. He said, why don't you go off and take the weekend, get a couple of doubles and shoot me something? I said, well, I could go. I know Cornwall would be terrific, you know. He said, fine, whatever you want to do it. So he gave me the camera, film, and no lights, obviously, and the lenses. I had a friend, again, I'm not that far out of school, remember. I had a friend who always wanted to get his hands on a camera, I mean a 35mm camera, with Panavision lenses, you know, anamorphic lenses. So for him it was a thrill. I had another friend whose parents had a cottage in Cornwall. So he and the girlfriend came along as the doubles for Vincent Price and Beth Shepherd, which was quite easy because they were in costume. And in a distance, characters looked the same. Also, Vincent had a tall black hat, you know. So that was all helpful. On the way to Cornwall, we stopped at Stonehenge and thought, that'll be great. In those days, you could just get out of the car and go up the hill and into Stonehenge. And I shot there at dawn, just after dawn. Nobody bothered us. We just shot it, you know, which you couldn't do now. And I thought it was really interesting to go to a place of an old and well-known monument would help the film in a way, you know, make it real. And so it did. And in fact, that was really a clue in the film, because this was the first film of Rogers, of the Poe series, that really had exteriors in it. And they're sunlit exteriors, they're not night exteriors. His other films were almost exclusively indoor, interior, night, with a lot of special lighting and so on. Here we had a lot of daytime scenes. So there was an atmosphere of reality of a kind. So it helped. So that was what I did shooting. And then after that, he said he wanted to find a composer. Had I any ideas? And I was very keen on, not that I knew her, but I was very keen on Elizabeth Lutyens. So he said, well, go and see her and talk to her, which I did. And she'd done film music before, but she wasn't keen on what she thought was a Poe, well, it was a Poe film, a horror film. So eventually Ken Jones did it, but I don't know him. But so broadly speaking, what I did on the film was to make suggestions, some of which accepted, some of the things I did, some were excluded, you know, that was it. But it was an incredible, as they say, learning curve. You can't train a cat. So a local village lady came up with a cat, and she had her little Tibby, and so the cat was all right, but of course ran away, scared. I mean, any sound. Then we got a professional, so-called professional cat wrangler or animal wrangler who brought a cat. That ran away too. Then we had another village cat, I think, somewhere again in Norfolk. And then this cat got lost, and the woman was in floods of tears, and it was all terrible. So we just had to pick up what we could in pieces with the cat, ending up with Vincent, you know, fighting with the cat, although it wasn't him, in fact. Those scenes he'd left, maybe he'd shot one or two movements, he'd left, and the hands, grasping the cat by the throat, and the venomous cat, was actually Roger's hands, because there was no one else there. And we looked at the thing and we saw, look, he's wearing a watch. Roger, we shot for 5 minutes with this cat and Roger's hands, but he had his Movado watch on, so that had to come off and we had to do that again. Cats are a nightmare, Now, of course, it would be CGI and there'd be no problem at all. It was an outdoor horror movie in a way. There's the castle, or the abbey, the ruined abbey. But the lawns around it, of course, are all manicured because it's a site, it's a heritage site. That gave it a very strange feeling, as if it was like a floating island. Why didn't it have long grass? Well, we talked about that, Roger and I. I just said, don't you need a bit more? He said, but I can't cover it. I can't afford to cover the whole place, so we'll just do it the way it is. It's almost as if the action is taking place in a contemporary setting. There are other things too. The burial, I think it begins with the burial, and the stone is in place. Now the stone, Ligeia's stone, would never be there at the same time as a burial, clearly, because you wait for the earth to settle and then you put the stone in 9 months later. Again, I'd sort of said to Roger, do you think this? Yes, he didn't care. He wanted a stone, so that was that. However, despite the fact that he didn't mind all these, quote, anomalies, it actually gave a strange flavour to the film, I thought. And maybe that's me being a cinephile, but I could see that this idea that it was taking place reenacted in a way, in a modern setting, rather like Franju did in Spotlight on Murder, it's called in English, Plein Feu sur l'Assassin. Franju, and there's no connection with Roger whatsoever, and I don't think he'd ever seen a Franju movie, well, he might have seen Eyes Without a Face, but it's the idea that you do something, you mix periods. And that's what he did. I mean, he didn't mix periods to the extent of having modern transport, but the look was quite modern, postcardy modern. The people were in their outfits, the characters are in it. When you move inside, we used the sets, pieces of the set of the film Beckett, which had just finished at Shepperton, where we were shooting. Beckett, with a budget of several million, with Richard Burton and Peter O'Toole, had wonderful pieces of, masonry and arches, and so they were all, Roger just put them all on his set. They didn't make any sense. The interior could not match the exterior, but he didn't care. The interior was a world of its own. So all of these things were done for efficacy, for cheapness, for whatever. However, when you look at the film, particularly today, that difference, that the anachronism, the oddity of that, may not strike you immediately, but it gives you quite an interesting flavour of the film, which the other films of Poe that Roger did don't have, So I like the film enormously for that reason, that it was this odd, it was a hybrid. Roger was very keen on the rules, and I discovered later that his Bible was a book by Joseph Campbell, a Jungian historian, cultural historian, and the book was called The Hero with 1,000 Faces. Very successful in America. And in fact, he's a great scholar, Campbell. Joseph Campbell? Yes, I think so. And he produced many books on Jungian archetypes. And Roger became really convinced by this, that if you follow the archetype, that everybody does exactly what the myth or legend says you will have a successful structure. And he did that for every film. You know, he had rules. He didn't mind what you did with them, but you had to stick to the rules. So he had a curious way of, not curious, a way of working that is not typical of Hollywood. And if you go, oh, well, he's a sort of Hollywood. He's not really. He's very independent, very anarchic. I mean, no one would have made a film like The Trip, you know, with that Peter Fonda made with Dennis Hopper, it was a big hit. A drug movie. No one would have done that except Roger Corman in Hollywood. Not an art movie, a commercial, low-budget drug movie with, you know, hallucinations and so on. Nobody would have done that except Roger. So he was quite adventurous, or could be. He made one very good film of his own, which he liked best, and it's called The Intruder, with William Shatner. It's a realistic film, set in a small town in the South. It's about racism. Really good. Not typical of any of the other films he ever made, really. And in fact, at the end of the film, he said, look, would you like to write one for me? I said, wow, yes, nobody had ever asked me to do that. So he wanted to make a film, the next Poe film, based on the great poem Annabel Lee. I don't know why, but it's a beautiful story, but anyway, so I started to do that, and he said, no, I'm not going to make any more Poe films. I can't remember exactly when he decided that, but I'd started to write, again for Vincent Price. And he said, I was terribly disappointed. He said, they're not making any money now, and you know that cycle is over. I think Ligeia was number 7, I'm not sure. So he said, but don't worry, keep the money and write me something else. So I did, which was a kind of spy film, which was very popular at the time. You know. I mean, it didn't get made, but it got me to Hollywood, and so I got started. But the first script I ever wrote and got paid for was for Roger, £500. He just opened his wallet and gave me £500. No contract, no nothing, just go write it. And that was it. And we stayed friends.